in the presentation. But I guess just as a quick introduction, I started an organization called FailForward that is dedicated to creating a more productive relationship with failure so that learning and innovation thrive, largely in the nonprofit sector, but increasingly so in government and private sector as well. So that's me.
I'm Anne. I'm part of the science and delivery team, and we've been having these videos. And my background is in project design and evaluation, and energy information management. That's where the science and delivery team.
I am Shannon Gillette, and I'm from USAID. I am in the Bureau for Food Security. I have been assigned to the Bureau for Global Health to work on infectious disease issues. So my portfolio is changing somewhat.
Hi, I'm Daniel Ortega. I also work with the science and delivery team. I'm basically focusing on two issues. One is what we call model engagements, which is how to work with teams on the ground to see how the new model of the bank is working or not, and also starting some research on problem-driven issues. My background is in public policy and government.
I'm Mike Kakano. I work in the education global practice at the bank on technology and education stuff. I've been involved in a whole bunch of fail fairs and things like that. I used to organize them sort of internally under the radar here at the bank. The last one that we did that I was involved in, we had over 600 people sign up for. So that was a problem in some ways because then it wasn't under the radar anymore. And because then we had this larger interest in lots of pronouncements about failure actually from on high, and which was awesome, was great, but it also meant that there were lots of eyes at the middle level paying attention to this stuff where all of a sudden people are a lot less willing to be involved, or people are much more worried. So it was interesting that as things moved from the sort of below the radar to having official support, a lot of things died at the government.
Interesting.
So it was the last. That was the last HD4. So it was about, yeah. So we had, and I think I've done 500 maybe.
I'm Christina Lane. I work on science and delivery, and I work for the front office of the GPs and support teams and monitoring evaluation results.
So we've met before. I'm Ryan Watkins. I guess I'm the organizer of these. I actually got introduced to fail fairs from a blog that Mike wrote several years ago about how to have a successful fail fair, and he gave all the rules kind of to lay out for that, which was my first introduction to fail fairs about 2 years ago. And Mike has also spoken with my classes at GW, where I teach on technology, international education, instructional design, monitoring and evaluation type of things. So we'll jump back over to that.
Hi, thank you. My name is Berta Vicena, and I work in the Inter-American Development Bank. I am working in the Department for Knowledge and Learning. And we have a team that works on learning from the experience. So that's
Well,
It's all you.
thank you so much for inviting me to come share a little bit about my work with this truly unique group. It's really an honor to be here. I'm going to start a little unconventionally and get you all to think of failure, think of the word failure, think of the experience of failure. What jumps into your mind? What words pop into your head when you think of that experience? Yell it.
Frustration.
Learning, I mean, if you're in science, you're going to, if you're doing research, you're going to fail probably. I mean, you're going to go down several paths and
Do experimentation. Yeah. So, here I brought years worth of failure reports. I'll show you one of them. This is the one from 2013 that we're just about to launch for 2014 this weekend, so I don't have it with me. But this particular report is 27 pages, 14 stories, prove that this organization, Engineers Without Borders, failed at least, but probably more than 14 times in 2013. What comes to mind when you think of them? This organization and the people who wrote these stories to be published publicly for everyone to read forever. What words pop into your head when you think of them?
Well, if you're engineering something, you probably don't want it to fail when it's a bridge, or so you probably build in processes for failure early on, so that when you get to the final point, you're more certain it's going to work.
Ideally, yeah, you get those iterations and end up with something that works.
And I say example. I mean, I'm a big fan of this. I use it as like, look, these guys do it. It's out there. They're not just as a one-off. I mean, even failure is a buzzword in a lot of places now, but these folks have stayed with it and continue to do this, and I think it's important for some reason. So maybe it's worthwhile for you to think about this.
Yeah, and then we'll talk about why it's important, how it works, and also how it doesn't work. But yeah, any other thoughts or words jump into your mind when you think of these guys and these people?
I think of engineers, I know. They work so hard to avoid failure, but they still have failure. And then we don't work at all hard to avoid failure. So think of how much more failure we must have in our area, because we don't even have all the built-in systems that they have to ensure the bridge doesn't fall down. And so we must have exponentially more failure that we're sweeping under the rug. If they have that much, and we're doing basically nothing. So.
And they also, often, if you're in an engineering program, you're not learning about failure due to policy or due to, other issues that may be out of your control within a lab or something. So engineers without borders, I guess, what comes to mind are engineers that are actually facing kind of failure that could be more with policy or culture or so.
And maybe a word you're fishing for actually is brave. I mean, you get this stuff out there, and I mean, there's in a number of the groups where I show this kind of stuff to, they say, that's great, but those guys, and maybe they're wrong, are funded by their members. I don't know if that's actually true or not, but that's a perception saying that, but our funders won't, I mean, they may kind of like what we talk about, but they really don't. Especially if it's with their money.
Cool. So that was just a quick introduction to the, to the disconnect between how we think about the experience of failure and the concepts we associate with that. I mean, the words that we've heard, poor performance, misuse resources, things like that. But when we actually consider folks who write these stories and fail and talk about it, I didn't hear one negative perception. It's all about that growth and that learning and that dealing with complex issues and bravery. And so it's I ask that question to a lot of audiences, and every time, different words, same trend where it's amazing how differently we perceive the experience of failure compared with how we perceive people and organizations who fail. And it's really in that spirit of expanding perceptions of what failure could be, and to learn to deal with it really productively is why I have a job. I'm actually going to call on my friend here, Benjamin Zander. He is an educator and the conductor of the Boston Philharmonic Orchestra. Second here. And he has a few things to say about reacting productively to failure, and I'm just going to allow him to
Very important to be right. The teacher is always right. And the students try to be right, as one of these young ladies said, the best way to be right is not to say anything, then you will be wrong. Now, I believe the exact opposite, which is you cannot learn anything unless you make a mistake. So I tell my students, when you make a mistake, celebrate. And the way to celebrate is like this. How fascinating! It's actually quite difficult. Try that on the golf course next time you're out. You know why it's difficult? It's because When we make a mistake, we tend to pull down, the body pulls down. Notice the next time you make a mistake, the body pulls down. Now instead, when it pulls down, you go, how fascinating, it's like this, it's difficult to do it again.
All right, thanks, Ben. Really appreciate your views. Perhaps you can guess what I am about to ask you to do. I like to bring an element of experience into every talk that I give. And this one, I would like us all to think of a failure that we've had, something we messed up. Let yourself go back there, and instead of letting our bodies pull down, on a count of 3, we are all going to yell, "How fascinating!" Yes, we are. Your giggles tell me you might be feeling a little silly or embarrassed about that. It's okay, you can close your eyes, no one will see you. But for real, on 3, we're all going to do this. Ready? Think of your failure. Really let yourself go back. Remember what it was like. 1, 2, 3.
How fascinating!
Obviously, a very simple activity for dealing with our failures, and silly, I know. But I love it, and I love bringing it into my talks because I think it is also exceptionally profound. And that, imagine if every time we failed, instead of pointing fingers, we asked ourselves, how fascinating, what did I learn? And every time our partners, our colleagues, our peers failed, instead of blaming or punishing, we went up to them with this kind of appreciation and curiosity and said, how fascinating, what did you learn? How much that would fundamentally change the way that we interact. There's also a deeper message here in that it's not failure we fear. We talk about fear failure all the time. It's not the failure itself that we fear, it's the prospect of being seen as a failure by others that's so terrifying. And so I start off with this activity it's a little bit mean, but it's to actually get us to practice that risk of embarrassment. What if I was the only one that said how fascinating, how embarrassing would that be? And experience that discomfort, because it is uncomfortable. But I would argue that we absolutely have to be okay with that risk of embarrassment and looking foolish and failure if we're going to do something great. I love this quote. At 20, we worry about what others think of us. At 40, we don't care what they think of us. At 60, we discover they haven't been thinking of us at all. So I want to bring the 60-year-old wisdom into the world, really, but for right now, into this room, and recognize that we have to. It's not our instinct, but we have to get better at actually being okay with being wrong and being seen as wrong if we're going to do great things. End of the inspirational, motivational part of the talk, on to the really practical stuff. This is what I'm going to cover in the next 35 minutes. Specifically, really quickly go over my work with my company, FailForward. Spent quite a bit of time sharing examples of what I do, what this looks like, what works and what doesn't. So what this actually looks like, hopefully as a means to get inspired about what's possible, about what else is happening out there. Talk about some of the barriers. I had a chance to chat with Ryan before this, try to understand what the barriers to this, dealing with failure more intelligently might be for this particular group. Then discuss what cultural norms would look like, and then end on a very tangible level, specific action items. So that's and all this in a very short 35 minutes. So I guess to start, this is my job. Full-time, I'm a full-time failure. And I know I'm a full-time failure because whenever I sit on a panel, the other panelists, whenever they reference failure, point to me. Yeah, and then we had this failure, this happened, or we're really trying to learn from that failure. It's kind of fun. So yeah, full-time failure, you might ask yourself how one becomes a full-time failure. I'm sure there are many routes to take. The one that I took was, I started off by leading this here fancy report, saw how much power that had within the organizational context to create a culture where people felt safe sharing failure all year round, not just once a year when the report was published. And took that, was inspired by that, really tried to create a failure report for the world by launching this here site, admittingfailure.com. I built it as a database, claimed never again would a mistake be repeated because everywhere around the world anyone could submit stories of failure and learning. You could search it by project type, location, organization, things like that. Pitched it to engineers who have orders for funding, claiming it would catalyze a new era of collaborative learning. You can probably guess where this story is going at this point. It was over 4 years since I launched that site. There are 33 fabulous stories of failure on that site. Not quite that new era of collaborative learning I was hoping for. And actually 6 months after I launched, all of the funding was cut to the project, and I was left with the very real irony that, that the failure website had failed. While I was recovering from that, I started to realize that a bunch of other organizations were really interested in this concept of a failure report and mini failure. Everyone from Deloitte to the Canadian government, from Greenpeace to the UN, like just a huge range of organizations. So kind of as a side project, started to do this work with other organizations. It took too long before that side project was bigger than my full-time job, so I made the switch, made it my full-time job, and thus I become the full-time failure that's sitting in front of you. Now, again, 4 years later, I've worked with, counted just a couple of days ago, 94 different organizations over the last 4 years, which seems like an astronomical number. But, and really it's gone well beyond the failure report. I've started to conceptualize the shift in organizational culture on 3 levels, which you can see here. That bottom level, start the conversation, is really what we're doing here, right? We're creating a language for talking about failure more productively. This also happens at fail fairs. It's what fail fairs do really well. And I give keynotes as well. So that would be an example of what starting a conversation looks like. At the build the skill level, it recognizes that failure is a skill, and it's one that we are not taught. And so my job, as I see it, is to create the resources and I guess the training, the experiences that we get better at the skill of failing well, which includes things like communicating failure in a way that maximizes learning, how to decouple ego from activity in times of failure to really separate yourself from the experience, to look more objectively at the failure, and at the organizational level, that skill might look like taking individual learning and turning that into organizational change. And then the very last level is developing the tools. I already talked about the failure report. It's an example of a tool. I have a risk appetite assessment that has organizations sort of discuss and assess how much and what kind of failure is acceptable in pursuit of innovation and what's just too much, so that you can be innovative without being reckless. Blameless postmortems are a good example. Developing evaluation criteria around learning and adaptation is another example of a tool, all of which are aimed at building intelligent failure into the DNA of an organization. That's great, actually. Look at all those things you just talked about. You probably still don't have a really good idea of what I do. What does a full-time failure do on any given day? What does this work look like? So I want to share a bunch of examples. I'm going to share them really briefly. I'm not going to go into depth on any of them. So if one catches your attention, note it down, and we should have 20 minutes to 15 minutes just for Q&A at the end. So I'd be happy to dive into any of these examples. Really, the idea here is to get inspired by what else is happening out there, and look for ideas that might apply to your context that you could bring back home. All right, first example. This is a fun one. One of my first clients was a branch of the UN called IFAD. They fund their agricultural development work. And I was hired to create this more productive relationship with failure. specifically in their operations. Right? They wanted people that were at the field level to be able to interact with failure more productively. So my job, actually, in flying to Rome was to convince this guy, Mr. Kevin Cleaver, that this whole intelligent failure thing was a good idea. Arrive in Rome, I'm getting a tour of this beautiful building, and who should I run into in the hallway but Kevin Cleaver himself? So I try to shake off the jet lag, not look too nervous, stick my hand like, "Hi, I'm Ashley, nice to meet you." To which he, without taking my hand, says, "I know who you are. Failure is for losers," and walks away. Which deserves its own slide. So I love telling the story. Honestly, I don't want to paint Kevin in a poor light here because he is incredibly intelligent and well respected as a leader and a remarkable human being all around. I tell this story because to me that interaction represents a world. Many people who grew up in a world really where failure was not an option. And I would argue that possibly one of the reasons why Kevin was so successful is because he genuinely believed that failure is for losers. But I would argue, and actually I think Kevin would agree, that that is a legacy and a world that no longer exists. So we need to change our way of thinking about failure. So after that auspicious first meeting, I had a 20-minute meeting booked for the next day. It turns into this hour-and-a-half debate, which was super exciting. You might say we got that conversation started. And I worked with the organization for the next week, and then intermittently for the next year. And at the end of that year, IFAD hosted their first, and a UN first, Fail Fair, which, as astonishing as it was, given that first interaction, Kevin Cleaver himself hosted the event and kicked it off by sharing 3 of his own personal stories of failure. I had the very good fortune of having dinner with him the night before that, and I couldn't help myself. I was just like, what did I say? What was it? What changed your opinion? Because, honestly, I need to repeat that over and over again. And he kind of laughs at me, and he just says, Ashley, I just never thought about failure in that way before. Good to know. So the Fail Fair happened, and it was it was a wonderful event. I think the most powerful thing that came out of it was that it created momentum for specifically the human resource department to interact with the experts. You can see Kevin there sitting in between Dave Snowden and Tim Harford, who those guys are. Have the organization interact with these experts on this, and their HR department ended up walking away with the momentum to change their hiring and training processes. So they were actually looking for intelligent failure competencies in how they hired and trained for. So that I'd say that's one of those structural tools that really help the organization embed that into what they do. All right, second story. This handsome devil here is Canada's head of state, His Excellency, the Right Honourable David Johnston, 28th Governor General of Canada, was invited to his lovely estate at Rideau Hall to help to build a framework for the Rideau Hall Foundation, a foundation for the future of Canada. Very oh, it's big. Actually, speaking of making a fool of yourself, I'm on that grass right there, having tea, about to meet the Governor General, and I get into this super interesting conversation with one of my peers that was there, also to construct this blueprint for the foundation. And I'm so caught up in this conversation, I don't really realize that I'm moving along this line to meet the Governor General, His Excellency, and all of a sudden my friend that I'm talking to kind of turns me around, and there's David Johnston sitting, standing in front of me with his arm out ready to meet me. He looks at my name tag. He says, "Oh, it's lovely to meet you, Ashley." And I go, "Oh yeah, kind of a little flustered. I'm holding this awkwardly fancy teacup." And it's like, "Oh yeah, great to meet you, David." And like a hush falls over the crowd. There's like cameras watching us, and my friend kind of leans in and goes, "His name is Excellency." Whoops. His Excellency and his wife sent me a Christmas card, so I think they forgave the FUB in his name. But I was embarrassed about that for ages. Anyway, here to design a foundation for the future of Canada. On the evaluation team, designing the evaluation structure, had the amazing opportunity to build learning and adaptation into what the foundation considers success. So it's not that we're hoping that learning and adaptation happens so that we get to success, it's that learning and adaptation is success because they know they're trying to do something super innovative, super new, and they're going to have to adapt to that. It's just as valuable as success. So, second example. Third example is from Engineers Without Borders. I had the great pleasure of running a workshop with the former CEO of Engineers Without Borders, George Roeder. He talked about the 3 cultural elements that he built into his organization that helped create this spirit. He called it the 3 F's: failure, freedom, and feedback. The 3 F's. So failure, I've already talked about the failure reports. We just launched the 7th annual report with them, or just launched the 7th annual report. 7 years of documenting failures from across the organization creates an amazing opportunity to trend failures. And failure modes. What are the patterns that you see over and over again? And what are those organizational tensions that you're going to accept that failure is going to repeat? Because that is a fundamental tension in an organization. Have those kinds of conversations in a really intelligent way. The second F, freedom. George talked about that as how he expects that everyone in the organization treats everything they do as an experiment. And by that, he didn't mean that we're just playing around, trying things out, being all willy-nilly about things. He said, really believes the opposite, that experimentation is because we take those problems very seriously, like a scientist trying to find a cure. And knowing that you don't know the answer means that you have to try a whole bunch of things, figure out what works and what doesn't, so that you can get to that answer and be really rigorous about what works and what doesn't. And then the third F was, of course, feedback. Story I like to tell for this one is there was a particularly nasty failure in 2013, and George hired me in to help run what I call blameless postmortem process. Basically, they had over-projected revenues, mismanaged cash flow, and had a transition in accounting staff at around the same time that left them blind, ended up with a severe cash crunch that meant that they had to lay off staff. Pretty serious for a small organization. So my job in this blameless postmortem was interviewing everybody that was involved in this failure. Out of those interviews, I came up with an action item list of 34 action items to help improve the organization. But there was another list that no one saw, and that list was likely just as long, criticisms directed specifically at George's leadership. So I'm looking at this list of feedback for George, and all I can think is, this is awesome. This is the kind of stuff that leaders never hear, right? Completely unfiltered, but anonymous feedback. So I get really excited, call George up on the phone. He's a busy guy, get right to the point. Yeah, I've got a list of 34 action items I'll present tomorrow, but I've also got this other list of ways your staff thinks you're failing. Item 1, and I go through 30 minutes of criticisms for this poor man from the people that he had spent 10 years supporting. And you can just imagine the courage that took and the strength that took to sit there and take it and listen and really listen. But I think that that's the kind of leaders that our organizations need, those that are willing to seek out that depth of feedback and learning. The other piece of feedback that's important in that is that it allowed for what Chris Argis refers to as double loop learning. So a couple nods, people know what that is in general. Basically, there were a lot of, in that 34 action item list, there were a lot of single loop learning things, kind of strategies and techniques to avoid that failure in future. Things like have better transition processes and, manage your cash flow better when you change models of your organization. But in terms of dealing with those assumptions and fundamental norms driving the organization, an example that we found was specifically on the overestimation of revenue generation, was that a number of folks that I interviewed said that they kind of knew that revenues were being over-projected, but they just didn't feel like they could question the executive. They couldn't challenge that, whether that was an issue of not having enough financial acumen or whether it was simply that the executive is really enthusiastic and convincing, and you didn't want to be the person when everybody's all riled up to be like, oh, I don't think you can do that actually. And so addressing that fundamental norm of the fear to speak truth to power really starts to build a stronger organization overall, not just addressing that one failure. So as the example at EWB, an example is working with this fellow from the Skoll Foundation who with Aaron Reed, and he, similar to me, got labeled the failure guy because he was determined to create the culture where people felt safe talking about failure at school. And he did that by being the change. He was just going to share all of his own failures, which is why he got labeled the failure guy, but nobody else was picking up on this behavior. So he started to look for structural barriers to learning at his organization. And what that meant in that context was, the one that he found was kind of the lowest hanging fruit, I would say, is they were making decisions on how to, on what investments to make in the coming year before they had taken the time to look back on the previous year and what they'd learned from the investments they made the year before. You can imagine a huge barrier to learning and using that learning to make better decisions going forward. So Aaron launched a campaign to switch that timing in conjunction with his campaign to be more open and honest about what wasn't working, what they were doing that was working and wasn't. And he found that when you paired that structural, tangible change with the more cultural, behavioral change, that was when you really started to see changes across the board. One group I worked with, one of the private sector clients that I've worked with, big private sector client, decided to include discussions about failure in their weekly meetings. Something they're already doing. They just wanted to bring that conversation without any added resources put towards it. Just have a conversation about what's working, not to solve it, but to be aware of it. Those are some of the examples of things I've worked on. There are a bunch of other examples I want to share that are not mine, but are still worth talking about. This school in California has FailForward Fridays. They encourage both students and teachers to try things that scare them, that they might fail at, that are new, just as in the spirit of creating that comfortability with uncertainty and embarrassment. Twyla Tharp, world famous dance choreographer, at the height of her career, puts on this terrible performance. It's like this rock and roll Billy Joel ballet fusion thing that critics tore apart. Yeah, tore it apart. Instead of kind of falling into that embarrassment, she gets her staff to seek out every piece of criticism that was written about that performance. It gets them to remove the personal attacks, because that's not so useful, and bring her the specific idea for what needed to change, what was awful about the performance, and use that feedback to redesign the entire performance to re-debut on Broadway to better reviews. Again, just an example of interacting with failure and treating failure as a gift, as opposed to something that just has to be dealt with. The Mayo Clinic has a Queasy Eagle Award, which honors the near wins. So ideas that almost made it, almost worked, but didn't. The statistics on this one are amazing. In the 18 years of the clinic before this award, they had 36 new ideas come through, so about 2 ideas per year. In the year following when they did this Queasy Eagle Award, they did 245 ideas in 1 year. So 100 times, over 100 times the number of ideas. So really effective incentive measure to get people feeling comfortable bringing ideas forward. Last example of what worked. These two Hanson Devils, Guillaume and Novosela, I mispronounce the name, are Nobel Prize winning physicists that isolated first two-dimensional material that was graphene, really cool material in general for the science geeks, conducts better than copper, almost invisible, super lightweight, but 200 times stronger than steel, stretches like rubber, like really, really amazing stuff. And they isolated that two-dimensional object in what they call Friday night experiments. So they dedicate 10% of their lab time to these Friday night experiments, but they insist that you only work on an idea for 2 months. And then you have to move on. If you can't turn it into something cool by then, move on to another idea. Basically a way of testing out crazy things that just might work. It probably won't, but if they did, it'd be really cool. And that's how they came across graphene. So those are the things that worked. To be consistent with what I talked about, I should talk about what didn't work as well. Obviously, admitting failure, I already mentioned that one. Same group that did the weekly meetings. They got really excited about this failure concept, made a big wall, labeled it the failure wall. They were going to put Post-its up of all the failures that they had talked about. 2 weeks later, they had sort of like 3 sad Post-its on the wall. Somebody moved a whiteboard in front of it. But that's okay, right? Like, not everything you're going to try to build this culture is going to work. And you got to be kind of meta about this in allowing some level of failure in your experiments, or how to create a culture that can talk about failure. Another thing that didn't work, I was working with this one organization to develop an innovation strategy, and they, really great organization, really wanted to be at the head of their game in terms of innovation. And worked with them for months on thinking about what a perfect innovation strategy would be, that flawless innovation strategy, when I had this sort of light bulb moment and the absurdity of trying to design a flawless innovation strategy struck me. Because they're trying to design a strategy that will allow them to invest in imperfect ideas, and yet they don't allow themselves the same space to be wrong in how they do that and how they encourage innovation. I was unable to articulate that. I still can't quite find the language to make a case for that. Wasn't able to make a perfect innovation strategy, and unfortunately, the innovation component was dropped from the organization.
So real quick, go back.
Yeah.
Is that a knitted piano cover?
Yeah.
So is that the
That's like what my grandma would have thought of. Let's cover pianos with hand knitted.
Is that the same movement of hand knitting, like leg warmer type things around
knitting.
trees?
I don't know where that photo came from. I had a designer friend send me these images. So
Yeah, there's something about making art in a lived environment, so trees are getting like little knitted leg warmers around them in various places that are cold and have
Okay.
love it. Random, citizen-driven, creative expression. Probably some better message in there too that I'll figure out later. But I already talked about the failure report working. It also doesn't work. Like everything, it comes with elements of both success and failure. My favorite story that was ever submitted to this report is called "Failing to Learn from the Failure Report." Meta. You can imagine what happened here. This is the 2012 report. In 2011, the story was written by a team. They, kind of maximized their learning around it, wrote a story, same failure, happened again the next year. And the author, Alex Kahn, recognized that they had repeated the same mistake again, so wrote the story as a failure from the failure report. This is just to point out that this is not necessarily a great learning tool. Just because a story is written down doesn't mean anything changes organizationally. So that's the failure report. Great. Those are all the examples. Hope there was a little bit of inspiration in there, something you can see applying in your context. As I was talking to Ryan in the lead up to this, I tried to understand what some of your barriers are to just doing some of these things. Why is it so hard? We have those examples. Why is it so hard to make that happen? I definitely don't know the nuances of your context, so I apologize for sort of the shallow understanding. But I do want to address some of the barriers that I heard coming out of our conversation, and those were that there is a risk of being blamed in times of failure for anyone that fails. This idea that there are people who do the work and so should be talking about what works and what doesn't, and then there are people, possibly the people in this room, that are like trying to learn from that, want them to share their stories so that we can understand that and spread that knowledge, and that sort of separation between us and them. And then the third is the lack of formal processes to learn. So really quickly, how I would address these: the risk of blame requires psychological safety. The us and them requires empathizing with the folks that you really want to be sharing failure stories, and having no processes. I could be wrong on this. I have been wrong before. It's happened. But from what I can tell, a process, like a formal structured learning process, might not be the best thing. It sounds like you guys have a lot of processes to follow. And I think what possibly is more important as a first step is recognizing the nuance of failures, that not all failures are created equally, so our response and learning strategies for each different kind of failure needs to be different. I'll talk about those in a bit more detail. That first one, that blame versus psychological safety, that risk of blame requiring psychological safety. Amy Evanson, a Harvard professor, talks about this at length. I really encourage you to watch her TED Talk called Building a Psychologically Safe Workplace. In it, she talks about how no one wakes up in the morning and is excited to look ignorant and incompetent and intrusive and negative, right? Nobody wants to do that. And there's as she says, there's very easy ways to not look ignorant, incompetent, intrusive, and negative. You simply don't ask questions, don't admit weakness, don't offer ideas, and don't critique the status quo. Great, you've just managed your desire to not look like all those bad things. But as you can see, that is going to greatly deter the possibility for learning and innovation. So what she suggests instead is creating a psychologically safe workplace, and her suggestions for how to do that are to frame the work as a learning problem, again, treating problems as experiments where the goal is learning, acknowledging failability. These last two are really important, especially for people in positions of leadership and power. Acknowledging failability, saying something like, oh, I might have missed something, inviting people to criticize, and modeling curiosity, asking lots of questions. The second barrier that I heard in Ryan and my conversation was that us and them, trying to get other people to talk about failures. And the model you see in front of you was inspired by a research question that Brené Brown, the famous researcher on vulnerability, she asked me about. What are the barriers and needs for sharing and owning our failures? And that research led me to, as you can see by the amount of text on this slide, uncover a lot of barriers to actually talking about our failures. So when you're hoping that somebody else will share their failures openly, because that's the right thing to do, really empathizing with the fact that that is an incredibly hard task. So chances are the reason they're not sharing a failure is not because they are a bad person, but for a number of factors that really need to be in place for that to be possible. Even recognizing our failure as a failure while we're in it is incredibly difficult thanks to confirmation bias and other neurobiological tendencies. If we do recognize our failure, then we face a decision and need a number of factors, both internal and external, to be in place to feel safe sharing that failure, from self-confidence internally to trusting in the people and understanding what the consequences are of sharing that story. And even if we do decide to share that story, we're not taught how to share it well in a way that people can understand the learning and take that away. So really, there's just, as we're asking people to talk about failures, if you are asking people to talk about their failures, recognizing there is a lot of pieces that need to be in place and empathizing with how hard it is. That last barrier, that there's no formal learning processes necessarily. Like I said, perhaps we don't need any more processes. Perhaps what's important is that we recognize there are many different types of failure, so our learning responses need to be appropriate and right-sized to the failure that we're talking about. Onto cultural norms. So we shared a bunch of examples. hopefully address some of the barriers that we face in this context. So now I want to describe sort of the norms that we're hoping to create in this work and what it might look like, with the ideological foundations for this work. One of them is recognizing that there is success and failure in everything we do when we work on complex problems. We tend to fall into this bifurcated thinking that that basically just means we think in black and white, yes and no, right, wrong, success and failure, when the reality is much more gray. And it's also recognizing that in times of success, we tend to attribute success to our own brilliance and failures to external factors, the environment, other people, luck, or bad luck in that case, when the reality is that both successes and failures are caused by both our own brilliance, or lack thereof, and as well as external factors. So treating it as that gray area. And also recognizing that everything we do comes with failure means that we reset expectations. That we cannot, it is absurd to expect 100% success when we are working on complex problems. So if we acknowledge that, it puts the onus on us to hold ourselves accountable to learning from whatever percent doesn't work. That becomes the goal. Basically redefining failure as a teachable moment. Second, cultural norm, or actually, well, I'd say this one builds on the last one, but perhaps surprisingly, I really love the sentiment failure is not an option. I think it's hugely inspirational and motivational when you're talking about your big operational goals. We want to end extreme poverty. That is a huge goal, and it's too important a problem. Failure is not an option. We have to figure this out, and we're not going to stop until we do. I love that sentiment. But I would argue that most of us, if not all of us, tend to spend our time working down here at the tactical level on day-to-day ways that hopefully get us closer to that goal in some way. And down here, I would argue that failure is always an option because we don't know how to achieve that goal, so we have to be willing to try things, treat our tests as experiments, learn from what works and gets us closer to our goal or gets us further away, and adapt accordingly. As I understand it, the goal of this group specifically is to build learning and learning cultures into your organizations, to improve that inter-organizational as well as intra-organizational learning. That's a big operational goal. To my knowledge, nobody has figured out how to do that perfectly. And so I would encourage everyone to see themselves sort of at the tactical level of testing out ways to create that big operational goal of creating those learning cultures and allow for some things that will work and some things will don't, and then adapt your efforts accordingly. Second piece of cultural norm I would suggest is getting out of this linear thinking. We tend to look, we're kind of trained and predisposed to think about problems linearly. We see a problem, we put a definition to that problem, we design a solution based on that definition, and we implement our solution, and maybe if there's time and resources at the end, we look back and learn from what doesn't, but probably not. That linear problem solving does not work for complex problems. I need to tell you guys this. That we need to be willing to continuously adapt, which means looking for failures all the time, expecting failures, and getting really good at detecting them and analyzing them. So we have a whole bunch of really small f, what IDEO calls small f failures, that sort of course correct us versus those big F failures that nobody wants. And the last cultural norm, really kind of a foundational piece, is to flip the idea of failure on its head. That failure can no longer be seen as an indicator that you are bad or incompetent or wrong. We have to start to see failure on some very deep level as an indicator that you're challenging yourself. Because that's what's going to create the space. Ideas for action. Specific things you can try are, as I said, get really meta about this, right? Become test cases in that learning culture. That means scheduling and learning, treating everything as an experiment, decoupling ego from activity so you can look at it more objectively. Talk about your own failures. You want others to, you've got to role model that. Give and receive feedback continuously, like George did. Work to unlock structural barriers, like Aaron at school did. And as I understand your organizations, you're working in organizations that have a bunch of different departments. As you're testing these approaches to building this learning culture, test them with other people in different departments, see if they work, learn from that, and trying to sort of spread those ideas like a very wonderful virus that it can be. So really specifically, first steps, test ways of creating culture and share with friends, contribute to psychological safety, and build nuance into how you and your colleagues discuss failure and think about failure. Because smoothies do not make a skillful sailor. Thank you.
Great.
I will also mention that I really try to practice what I preach. I love feedback. I love learning. This is the first time I've given this particular presentation. It's brand new. And the first time I've tried to share more than a handful of examples in a presentation. So I'd love to hear from you about what was useful, what worked, what didn't. On the changes side, those are changes like what are you taking away? What are you thinking about differently? What ideas do you have that are different? What actions will you take because of this? And then the question side, what's missing? What barriers do you still face? If there was a follow-up, what content would you want to see?
Could I just say it?
Sure.
Because if I wrote it, I think it would be
Sure, I'll get my pen and paper.
Sometimes I can't read it myself. What I would be interested in is two things specifically. One is how do you model communicating and talking about failure in a constructive way where you get to the next step. And I think if you look at people who run labs, a lot of times their lab teams, the ones that are the most effective or successful are the ones that somehow have learned how to have that communication with the team and do that effectively each week or however they do it. So communication part seems to be key, and I'd like to know what are those key parts of it that have worked the best. And then I guess the second one is there are people who are just very good at being efficient about learning from failure and moving on. So, like, if you're in Silicon Valley, a lot of people end up failing like 3 or 4 times before they get to the thing that actually works. But the ones that actually get to the 5th stage usually are the ones that are learning how to fail efficiently so that they're learning quite a lot from the failures that they do make, so they're making big steps each time to get to that 5th stage. Whereas, so what is it, qualities about them that?
For the individual qualities.
Well, individual qualities and also like, it's kind of an expert process, I guess. I mean, they become experts at failing and learning from it and moving on. So what is the expert process and what do they know that novices don't, I guess?
Yeah.
And I think there's kind of 2 components to that. And one is the learning and one is the letting go. Some people I know just can't let go of the failure. Like it takes months for them to get over it. And others, let's go on to the next thing.
But sometimes that, like, going over and over it again helps you get to the next step. So how do you do that constructively without going forever and
Being
not getting out of it?
contained by it.
Yeah.
I mean, some people just never do get over something. You think of people like their marriage fails, they get a divorce. Some people, a year later, they're moved on. Other people, 10 years later, they're still bitter and angry, and it's consuming them in a very negative
There
way.
may be some context issues involved there.
Yeah. I could use a pen.
Yeah, that's it.
So you want a quick beep? I'll say it out loud too.
Great.
I'd make it presentation way shorter, way shorter. And I think as far as modeling, so I think models of actual real life practice where we can maybe see ourselves or our circumstances or contexts, and then allow more time for question and answers. Because I think you, and I imagine a lot of the folks in the room here sort of are with you from the start. That's the reason why they agreed to come to the meeting. And so you don't need to do that much convincing of them. They're already convinced. So at a certain point, over-convincing, I think, detracts from it. People are already on board. If you give more stuff, you're going to push them overboard, potentially. So I think shortly enough to make it.
Less examples,
Well,
less
I think
everything.
let's talk about failures, like sort of you're kind of already preaching to the semi-converted. And so if that's the case, once you get to a certain point, you can just back off and go right into models, modalities, questions, that kind of stuff. And I mean, that would be the major feedback.
Yeah, I had a whole bunch of stuff. I thought this talk would be 20 minutes. It was not.
They never are.
Yeah, I know, right? Yeah, it was interesting. I had a section called Tools and Frameworks, but yeah, lesson learned. Thank you.
So I guess since we have Mike here, and you've done fail fairs and stuff, and they haven't caught on predominantly. I mean, there's probably a better culture for talking about it, but it's still weak within the institution. What were your lessons learned? I won't label them as failures. I don't know what the goals were, but if they haven't achieved what you had hoped,
So
what kind of would you say were the lessons learned about failure from that?
So very, not really huge, we're very modest in expectations. The idea was to create a space where people would come together and meet and talk with each other in a way that they normally don't. That was like full stop, that's what we wanted to do. And we happened to think failure was talking about stuff that they goofed up on was a way to do that. And so recruiting people to participate in those conversations, I mean, like any meeting, it's people who are in the meeting that really determine whether it's any good or not. Within an institution like this, with all of the different cultural, multicultural aspects and issues that people bring, and so we found certain nationalities would immediately say, oh yeah, we're done with that. Others, there was 0% chance they would do that. And one of the decisions we didn't make at the start, we realized pretty quickly, is that we would agree to go talk to someone's supervisor if they were going to participate in this sort of activity, to give these people cover, a little bit of cover, and to give, we didn't do that at the start. We did a lot of hokey things to try to make it seem very informal. There was no recording, there was no reporting on anything. We even did stupid stuff like you can only be identified by your first name and last initial. Everybody knows, everybody who's in the room. Or if not, they looked them up very quickly once they were on stage. It was a lot easier to find men than women. It was almost impossible to find women in sufficiently equal numbers. So we changed, and we would allow 2 presenters, like 2 people talking together, and those 2 presenters were always 2 women. Like I'll do it if she will do it with me. And that was something we didn't see at the start. There are obviously cultural things inside this institution and just culturally around the world that may contribute to that. And obviously required to talk about yourself and not talk about other people. But trying to keep people on track to talk about themselves and not other people is difficult. Yeah? Because even, I mean, you want to start, I really bet it's like, that sounds like Mike is talking about Ryan's failure. And so that prep to get people in a place, because again, it was just an idea to try to create a space for people to meet each other in a different way, because we didn't have any large grand ambitions. And a big failure, I mean, it was great when there was larger attention to this issue, but it was really interesting to see what happened. And I went around to a lot of the meetings where they were deciding what failures they wanted to bubble up to the top to have officially discussed, and those were then political discussions, not learning discussions. Absolutely.
Because it's interesting here. I mean, the president talks about failure, like the concept of learning from failure. It's not unknown to the president of the World Bank, but then there's this disconnect. You're kind of, I see it as the grassroots level to talk about failure, And there is some level of support at the very top, but then there's a whole
I think-
missing thing
I
in
think
the
there's a huge
middle
level of support at the top. I think that middle level, because those are the people who then, I mean,
with ambitions to get to the top.
yeah, you don't really, I mean, when you're in the middle, you don't really do anything, really. I mean, you are responsible for people, and then you are reporting up, so your level of abstraction from this stuff, it puts you in a different position. And, I mean, if you're working level and you goof up, you can learn. I mean, it helps you, it impacts you. If you're the people report on that, it doesn't.
Yeah.
And so managing those expectations around that is, I mean, that's why I just sort of stopped doing it for a while, figuring it was too much attention to it. And there was too much attention to it.
So you stopped, so
Yeah.
when?
It just wasn't worth
It
it.
just was one, right? One.
I had like 5.
How
Yeah.
Until which year?
So whenever we did our big internal official, there was a big event in the Preston Auditorium.
Mm-hmm.
Whenever that official, then that's where it
That was
started.
the last one.
Well, I wasn't involved in that at all. But I mean, there were great bureaucratic maneuver. I mean, there was a steering committee on failure and these kind of things, which to me is a kiss of death for anything. So I just said, yeah, it's just not worth it. Better uses of my time.
You said that the fail fair resulted in ground level ideas and projects being pulled back. You said that in your introduction. I'm not sure if I understood that correctly. I was just surprised to hear that. Can you elaborate on why that happened?
Yeah, I must have been inarticulate then on what I said. I don't remember exactly what I was trying to say, but the idea was that people would share about stuff they'd done. And other people would hear about that, and then they would maybe go and talk to I'm making the same mistake, and that was the whole point, to get to make those individual connections.
Mistakes.
Yeah, I mean, make different mistakes. Yeah, and so we pulled back just because there was more attention to this kind of stuff. That's why, like, the idea was it to be at a working level kind of thing. That said, every event we had, we did have someone senior kick things off, or share something, although oftentimes they would then leave the room. Mm-hmm. So we had President Kim speak very briefly at one, and then he left. We had our VP Global Practices. When he was not that, he spoke, and having him speak, because he's really respected, gave people sort of, I don't know, cover, or they said, okay, then I can do it if he's doing it.
Who was
And that
this?
was Keith. So Keith did it, and he's game for this kind of stuff. And then people saw him up there, and he's the first one to go. And we told people, we didn't tell people who else was doing it, except we told people that he was doing it, where we thought it would make a difference. Especially we told manager level people that he was doing it, and they said, oh, if he's doing it, this will be okay. If he's sharing it, I'm sure it'll be done in an appropriate way. And all the cultural stuff it's all culture. Yeah. Mm. The male-female stuff within this institution, and I actually brought on a couple more people. I didn't bring on, so people groups, so a couple more women to be involved with organizing, just to help with the outreach. Because I was wondering, maybe if I'm going to, maybe it's, well, sure, it's perceived differently than if someone else goes, for sure, and maybe if a guy or a woman goes to them, maybe it's different as well.
They might just feel more exposed.
Yeah,
I mean, if there are fewer, then
absolutely.
Whoever they are, if there are fewer, you just are more sensitive to exposure, because you're only one of 3 that are in this field doing something. And so I think it's probably you want to be with the other 3 when you discuss it.
Yeah, absolutely. So the gender thing was, and so we wouldn't let another guy participate until we had another woman. So we wanted to make sure it was all, and that was explicit. And then one of the ones we had more women than men, and so that was cool. But we didn't want one woman up there and a bunch of guys. And we just thought that would be, when we had that at an early stage, I mean, the woman was absolutely dynamite. And she'd go, and I mean, that's why she's dynamite at what she does. She just blows forward. But that cultural issue.
I haven't seen that gender dynamic in my work. It's interesting.
And certainly the multicultural aspect of here. I mean, depending where people
More,
are from,
yeah.
if it's all Canadians together, as diverse as Canada is, if it's all the states, as diverse as the US is, I mean,
Yeah.
just places like this.
Variations.
What I
do
thought
see
was
those dynamics playing out. Because I actually relate it less to culture, because everyone I've ever talked to says that they are risk averse and their failure is not allowed in their culture, no matter where you are, except if you're in Silicon Valley, maybe possibly the only exception. I relate it more to power than to culture. It's like to be able to talk about failure openly is a luxury of someone with power who is not at risk of sanction for disclosing that shortcoming. And quite honestly, there are dynamics of power in terms of racial differences. Whether we talk about
well, and risk comes in many. So my wife and I are both tenured faculty at the university. If I'm sitting in a faculty meeting, I say my mind. I'll talk to the board of trustees and tell them what I think is not working well. My wife would never. Both have that level of, there is no risk. We're not going to get fired for doing these things. So the risk comes on many different levels is what I've learned over the years, is that, she has professors who are full professors, top of their position, bring in millions of dollars of grants, tenured, should have every luxury of no risk in their life. The university would never get rid of them. They get paid well, big salaries and stuff. They still want to speak out because they are females. They might be from a certain culture and stuff. Whereas then you have people who probably should keep their mouth shut, who don't have all those luxuries, who for one reason or another feel like they should speak out. And so I think you have to think of the risk. It's not just job security. Job security might be an element of it, but there's a whole many layers, even if you hold that steady, that I never would have anticipated.
And
yeah,
change.
that fear
even.
of embarrassment that we
I think it's also change. I mean, if you're willing to see things change and you want to see things change for the better, I think you may be willing to look at failure and see how that can change. And if you don't want things to change, you may be unwilling to kind of look to the things that aren't working just because you want to kind of keep that status quo.
What I also wonder about too is you had a slide up there where you talked about time for reflection. And I know this would be true for probably a lot of people at the bank and at the IDB for sure.
Mm-hmm.
They never have time to actually think about their project as being success or failure because by the time they're implementing it, they're implementing for others. There is no reflection back. There is no labeling as this was a failure or this was a success. They literally just never think about it again. It's like they went to Brazil, they did their thing, they're on the plane to go somewhere else. There's no thinking about, well, what happened in Brazil? Is that good or bad? And how do you build? Because it makes it very difficult to talk about failure if no one ever labels things as success or failure. It's just, I look at your schedule and your tweets, it's like one thing after another. I don't know how people find time to reflect on what they've done.
Conference calls.
Conference calls.
But this is the valuing learning as much as doing. Like there's just an overemphasis on action and completing tasks that you can see and check, and it's actually a shift in how we think about what is progress, what is change, what is valuable, and because that block of that chunk of meeting that you scheduled for yourself for reflection and